George Orwell once wrote, "If thought corrupts language, then language can also corrupt thought. A bad usage can spread by tradition and imitation, even among people who do and know better." As a writer and a speaker, I spend a lot of time thinking about words, and I try to be very careful in how I use them. When I was a little girl and didn't understand what a word meant, instead of simply telling me, my father would always make me go and look it up in the dictionary. To this day, when I choose my words, I always make sure to look them up first. And you may be surprised with just how many of the everyday words we use have definitions that we may not necessarily expect. For example, if you look up the word commerce, a word we commonly use to describe the buying and selling of goods, you will find that the definition also includes sexual intercourse. I don't know how you feel about that, but I have to admit that it threw me off a bit. To think that the concept of commodification of women's bodies is so ingrained in our culture that Merriam-Webster is thought to include it in a reference book was a bit shocking to me. But the practice really is as old as time, as is the debate with how comfortable we are with the thought of commercial sex as a trade. While some have found the practice to be liberating, there are many who would argue that reducing a woman's earning potential to the value of her body is about as empowering as saying a woman's rightful place in life is barefoot and pregnant. To them, commercial sex dehumanizes and objectifies people by reducing them to items that can be bartered. It's the marketing of the human body as a recreational tool to be enjoyed by whoever has the dollar to spare. And even if it is a topic that you would prefer to shy away from, messages promoting a transactional view of sexuality and relationships pervade every aspect of American society. Whether it's the young woman being taught to marry rich and lend a lover who will buy her expensive gifts, or it's the constant bombarding with messages that sexuality is the key to fulfillment. I grew up in the South, so in addition to receiving all of these messages, I also heard a great deal about fast girls. These were girls who dressed or acted in a certain way that was more mature for their age, or more commonly girls who were involved with older men. Sadly, many people find it appropriate to shift responsibility from the adults who take advantage of a young girl to the girl who is actually taken advantage of. Some people even manage to do it in the same breath by saying things like, "What kind of a man would want to be with a child?" but quickly follow it up with, "Well, that's what happens when little girls run around being fast." I happened to be one of those young girls. As early as 12 years old, when I hit puberty and my body started to develop, I began to receive attention from older men. I remember walking home from school and having men blow horns and lean out of their car windows, making suggestive comments to me. In my mind, their attention qualified me as more than just a little girl. I started viewing myself as one of those girls who was mature for my age and bought into the hype that age ain't nothing but a number. And what was I supposed to think? Really? Any parent who has slipped up and said a curse word around their child knows that we learn by emulating, and that isn't limited to the home. We learn from our peers. We learn from what we take into the media. We learn from our cultural beliefs. And in a world where sex sells and thirst traps are an easy way to get attention, what do we really expect from young people? In Damaged Daughters, The History of Girls' Sexuality in the Juvenile Justice System, Lisa Pascoe describes in great detail a history of condemning wayward girls for sexual immorality that extends way back to the 19th century. Punishments were given with little to no consideration of whether the sex was coerced or the girl was a victim of incest. There was always an underlying belief that the girl must have done something to invite the sexual encounter. And that isn't limited to the juvenile justice system. In the 1940s, criminologists Benjamin Mendelsohn and Hans von Hintig went on to cultivate an entire school of thought implying that victimization could best be viewed on a spectrum. And in some cases, some of the blame for an offense could actually be placed on the one who was offended. Or in layman's terms, she was asking for it. Nearly 100 years later, we are still dealing with the ways that victim blaming has permeated our legal system. Up until 1994, in my home state of Tennessee, A 40-year-old man could avoid a statutory rape conviction for having sex with a 14-year-old girl as long as he could prove that she was promiscuous. And it was just in 2013 that a Tennessee court had to rule that a 42-year-old man could not excuse his sexual abuse of a 14-year-old because, as he claimed, she consented and was therefore an accomplice. Somewhere in the middle of those two developments, in 2004, as a 16-year-old runaway, I was arrested and tried as an adult for killing a 43-year-old man who picked me up for sex. All throughout my court procedures, I was referred to as a teen prostitute. There was actually a moment in my trial when the prosecutor paraded a naked photo that my trafficker took of me in front of the jury as further proof of why they should condemn me to a life of imprisonment. For more than 10 years, I walked around in a prison of shame with the title of prostitute and all of its inherent stigma attached to my experiences. I couldn't even find space to process the sexual trauma that I had gone through because over the years I had developed this little hiding space in my mind where I went to whenever the topic came up. To this day, even hearing the word teen prostitute sends a feeling through my body that's like nails grating across a chalkboard. In the years since my arrest, neurodevelopmental research has come up with a ton of findings about the teenage brain and how it works differently from adults when making decisions and solving problems. In short, the part of the brain that allows them to be level-headed isn't fully developed. They can make reasonable decisions in situations where they don't feel under pressure and have ample guidance, but they're more likely to react without weighing consequences and be susceptible to the influence of others in situations where emotions are heightened. It's how an otherwise reasonable and level-headed teenager can seem mature at the dinner table when discussing plans for college, but immediately go upstairs and film himself eating Tide Pods because his best friend challenged him to do it. Add to that the power imbalance between adults and minors, and it's clear to see how teen susceptibility to be influenced in emotional situations make them inherently more vulnerable to be preyed upon and less capable of giving meaningful consent. When the Trafficking Victims Protection Act was put into federal law, it was sure to define any commercial sex act with a person under the age of 18 as a most severe form of human trafficking. Just as severe as brutally forcing, defrauding, or coercing someone into trafficking. What a lot of people miss in the act is that anyone involved in any way, whether soliciting or purchasing a commercial sex act involving a minor, is guilty of sex trafficking. That means there's no such thing as a trick when it comes to teenagers. There's only traffickers. The fact that a minor cannot consent to sex with an adult is a key part of this. Because of the difference in brain function and power dynamic, youth are considered an intrinsically vulnerable population. And sex trafficking, when applied to minors, doesn't require blatant force, fraud, or coercion because the force, fraud, and coercion is inherent in the act of taking advantage of a vulnerable individual. But as a culture, we have yet to fully reconcile the term sex trafficking victim with the teens who have traditionally been labeled fast or promiscuous. We essentially view these kids as asking for it and erase the fact that they're children responding to the influence, predation, and manipulation of adults. Children responding to the hypersexualized messages that our society is constantly feeding them. As much as we discourage victim blaming when it comes to sexual assault, we still find a way to imply volition on the part of these children who are clearly being violated. Much of that stems from the fact that not everyone really understands how sex trafficking really happens. Contrary to popular belief, most sex trafficking victims are not kidnapped at gunpoint and locked inside of a room where they're made to sell their bodies, crying hysterically all day while waiting for someone to come rescue them. In fact, a 2011 study by researchers with Baylor University analyzed press releases and online media reports from a 9-year period and found that fewer than 10% of cases actually involved kidnapping. It's predominantly the psychological holds, the manipulation, that often lure youth into the life. In all actuality, many female victims of domestic minor sex trafficking share an experience that's similar to my own. You meet a guy, he listens, he gets you, he draws you in, promises you the world, And before you know it, you're ready to sacrifice it all in order to be with the man that you love. There's almost nothing he can ask you to do that you would tell him no, because he's finally giving you the attention and the affection that you've always wanted. Until, of course, he doesn't. And by that time, you learn to make excuses for him by blaming yourself. And once you've got to the point where you're desperate for him to love you the way that you thought he did in the beginning, he has you right where he wants you. And it's there that you become trapped in a cycle where you believe your best is never good enough, and you will never be more than what he says you are. The life of a person involved in the world of sex trafficking is not pretty. And 99% of the things they have to resort to in order to survive won't place them on the ideal end of any victimization spectrum. We still seem to struggle with wanting a victim to fit a certain mold before we actually see validity in their victimization. As a matter of fact, you'll be hard-pressed to find any talk about the experiences of young boys who are just as susceptible to being exploited as young girls. Our culture has shaped us in a way that we're more comfortable embracing social media narratives about unmarked vans snatching innocent girls off the street and forcing them into sex slavery, when in reality, we should be less worried about suspicious white vans in our neighborhood and more worried about the blatant whitewashing of victimization that we perpetuate in our communities. It all comes back to the power of the language that we choose. When we label these kids as prostitutes or promiscuous instead of sex trafficking victims and exploited youth, not only does the stigma of that word determine how they're perceived by the community, but it actually works to marginalize them in a way that keeps them trapped in the same cycle that abusers use to control them in the first place. So what does all this mean for the fight to end sex trafficking? If we don't know what a victim of sex trafficking looks like, how can we stop it? In 2017, researchers in Georgia found that 57.2% of individuals in their study believed that there are just some teens who choose to prostitute themselves. This is a study of mandated reporters, individuals whose work puts them in constant contact with children and who are required by law to report suspected sexual abuse. A different study published findings in 2019 that discussed the lack of clarity of what constitutes a victim of minor sex trafficking among service providers and the impact that it had on service provision. One missed opportunity to identify a victim of sex trafficking is one missed opportunity too many. When the very people who were put in place to protect the young people fail to see them as needing a protection, you have a serious problem. It's like your doctor failing to see that a gaping hole in your chest is cause for concern. And what's worse is when you yourself can't see that the hole in your chest is reason to seek out a doctor in the first place. And that's exactly what it's like when you can't identify yourself as a victim of sex trafficking because the world around you tells you that that word doesn't apply to kids like you. In order for us to effectively combat sex trafficking in our country, we have to change the narrative. And it's actually not that complicated. Whether we're talking about community members, legislative bodies, service providers, or impacted individuals, the language that we choose, the stories that we tell, the narratives that we give life to, all shape our responses to sex trafficking. If, as George Orwell said, a usage of language can spread by tradition and imitation, even among people who should and do know better, then people who know better can do better and create new tradition by spreading facts. If at the end of this video you just take 5 minutes to have this same conversation with someone else, you can play a role in reshaping the norms surrounding the teen sex trafficking epidemic. That is the Glitter Project, the grassroots learning initiative on teen trafficking, exploitation, and rape. And that is how we can begin to create a society where boys and girls are not goods to be sold, victimization can't be viewed on a spectrum, and there's no such thing as a teen prostitute.